Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are, and thank you for joining us today. Chum Rip Sur to all our Cambodian guests. Welcome to our second lecture in our series on the archaeology and art history of Southeast Asia. This is organized by the Temasek History Research Centre at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. My name is Noah Hidalgo Tan. I'm one of the conveners of this program, and I will be moderating this morning's session. Before I introduce our speaker today, let me get through some housekeeping. First, the chat box, and I'm seeing people saying good morning there. The chat box is really used for technical support. So if you have a problem, particularly with technical issues, please use the chat box for that. And for questions and answers, for questions, please use the Q&A box. So we will not be looking at the chat box for questions here. If you have questions, please use the question and answer box. As well, if you have questions, please identify yourself. Now for all our sessions, the Chatham House rules applies. So whatever is said in this session stays in this session. And I'll ask you to refrain from taking screen grabs or screen grabs. But if you wish to get a copy of the lecture, please feel free to contact our speaker for the slides later. Now this morning, I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Heng Piphal. He's a Cambodian who graduated with a PhD from the University of Hawaii in 2018 and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Northern Illinois University through a postdoc with the American Council of Learned Societies Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation for Buddhist Studies. Dr. Heng has had a long, illustrious record of working and directing field programs in Cambodia, and I've known him for about 10 years now. I remember our times working in Dupong under the Greater Angkor project, and I remember picking your brain about the significance of Phnom Penh and the cult of the God King, and I'm sure these names will come up in this talk. As I mentioned in the last lecture, in this series, we take a survey through some of the great civilizations of Southeast Asia. And in this regard, I can think of no better place than to start with than in Angkor. So this morning, we'll listen to Dr. Heng in his presentation on Angkor, people, monuments, city, and statecraft. And then after that, from about 11, we will have some time for questions. So take it away, Dr. Heng.
Right, thank you, Noah. Let me share my screen. Where am I? Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who have participated in my talk today. So as you see on the first slide, my talk today will focus on life in Angkor, specifically on Angkor as a city. This photo is taken at the Bayonne temple. They show kind of feastings or party. So people, mostly men, making food, and we will return to the theme afterward. So I have 4 main points to share with you today. First, I will talk about a very basic background of Angkor. And then I will talk about Angkor as a city. So what do we mean by city? Can we make ancient city, pre-industrial city like Angkor, legible for modern audience by combining archaeology with inscriptions, with Chinese accounts, with temples, bas-relief, and artist virtualization? or visualizations of Angkor itself. And then I will return to the themes. So from lost cities to lost in city, how we can use social science approaches to experience life in ancient cities like Angkor. And then I will conclude with the fact that from what we know, Angkor is cities, pre-industrial cities like Angkor, it's not lost, right? It just transforms through times and continue to serve different functions, specifically for Angkor, its symbolic function. So as a general background, most of you already know where it is. So Angkor controlled much of mainland Southeast Asia between the 9th to the 15th century. Its official start date is 802 CE. That was what they told us. And all began with Jayavarman II, the founder of the Angkorian dynasty. So showing on your top right is an artist's rendition of what the Devaraja, the cult of God King, began with Jayavarman II on Phnom Kulen. And Angkor civilization peaked between the 11th and 13th century, and its accepted end dates is 1431 or 1432. So what do we know about Angkor? Generally, is this landscape around Siem Reap town today. Angkor, in fact, in this landscape, it began with a pre-Angkorian center of Ot Yum. So it began around the 7th and 8th century as a population center. Then we know by the 9th century, Jayavarman II performed the Devaraja ritual on Phnom Kulen, Mahendra Parvata in this case. We know that he died at Hariharalaya, another early Angkorian center, an early city. And then Angkor itself, which is Yashodharapura, was found later in the 9th century, late 9th century, in this area here. So you could see the space is sandwiched between the Tonle Sap Lake, or the Great Lake, to the south, and the Phnom Kulen to the north. So Yashovaraman found Angkor with the name Nagara Sri Yashodharapura. Sometimes during his reign, like we know from the inscription that he relocated the capital there. He built the capital, but we do not know the exact date of that relocation. We know that the East Barai, I'm sorry, let me go back a little bit. So the major features of Angkor are these water features. The reservoir called the Barai. So you have the West Barai to your left, the East Barai to your right, and the North Barai is on the top. So the city of Angkor was the seat of the empire for over 500 years, from 900 to about 1450. By the 14th and 15th century, an inscription in Angkor called it Brahnagara, Pranoko, right? And then by the 17th century, the name Angkor became known in the inscriptions in Angkor Wat itself. So again, we know this landscape of Angkor as an engineered landscape of agro-urbanism, meaning that there were cities that incorporate agricultural fields into their urban designs. So Angkor and the people of Angkor were, the majority of them were farmers. So you see the city centers in Angkor, surrounded by water features, and then rice fields. The greater Angkor itself, the area between the Kulen Mountain and the Tonle Sap Lake in the map that you could see here, covers 3,000 square kilometers. The urban core itself, which comprises the area between these barriers, covers 30 square kilometers. That's the extent, that's the city center. And the populations between the 9th and 15th century for the greater Angkor region was somewhat between 500,000 to 900,000 people, so closer to 1 million. But the urban core, the recent estimate could host the population between 76,000 and 150,000 people. It's a very dense city for the time being. So what is a city? Like when we talk about city, what image that come up in our mind, right? So the common perception of a city, of course, refers to infrastructure, physical infrastructure especially. So we have urban infrastructures like highways, like railways, skyscrapers, special economic zones, and we could describe cities using these urban infrastructures like the road, right? So from Jane Jacobs' book, cities become interesting if the streets are interesting. And another way we can look at city, it has to do with social infrastructures. So the amenities provided to the city dwellers, like social services, like government institutions, like education, healthcare, market, and leisures, etc. So how do we experience city? If we go to a city, or if we live in a city, we make mental maps of our cities, right? To aid navigations, to guide social interactions, to prevent us from feeling lost, and to help city feel like home, because for the most part, cities are full of strangers. So how people perceive the environment, the built environment of the city, that is spatial arrangement of each features of the cities, of infrastructures, of buildings, of that comprises cities, that's its legibility. So according to Kevin Lynch, I'm sorry, this book published in the 1960s by Kevin Lynch, a sociologist, we can experience city through 5 elements. Paths, streets, they can be streets, canals, railroads, edges, which are boundaries, physical boundaries like walls, buildings, or perceived boundaries like this is a different neighborhood, that this is a dangerous neighborhood, that we make a mental map of. Another element is district. So it can be, let's say, a business district, a residential district. Nodes, generally in intersections of roads, like it can be at train stations, it can be a crossroad, that we use to guide to place ourselves in space. Another important point is landmark. So it can be a roundabout, it can be a building, it can be a sign, it can be mountain. Also help us navigate the city, give us some orientation. Now, having these elements in mind, how do we experience the city of Angkor itself? So in this talk, I use text, which include inscriptions, many of which was translated into French, a few in English, and the Chinese accounts, especially from Zhou Daquan, who visited Angkor in 1296 to 1297. And we combine those with the carvings, with the bas-reliefs, with other artistic visualizations, like from Maurice Fieret, a French artist who worked with Zoxodas and Bernard-Philippe Grolier in the 50s and 60s to come up with these drawing, with this painting of Angkor, of life in Angkor, that was published in National Geographic. And then we can contextualize them with new archaeological data. So I begin with landmark and notes. So remember, these are objects that help us guide the navigation in the city, that help guide us through the city. So on the left is the LiDAR map of Angkor. You see the Angkor Wat surrounded by moat at the bottom, Bakang mountain, and the city wall of Angkor Thom also surrounded by a moat. Then you have the Bayonne at the center, the East Barai to your right, North Barai on the top, and we have the Siem Reap River running down here. Let's read this excerpt from Zhou Daquan, right? This is a description of Angkor from a visitor. So in the center of the capital, there's a gold tower, which is the Bayonne. About a li north of the gold tower is a bronze tower, which is the Bapun that we know. About 1 li further north is the Royal Palace. And inside the palace, there's a gold tower, which we also know that there's a temple there called Piminaka. Half a li or so beyond the south gate. Again, south gate is a note because you can go through it. It's cover street, right? There's a stone tower mountain, which is the Phnom Bakang. Then Luban tombs, the Luban's tomb, Angkor Wat, lie about 1 li beyond the south gate. Again, using the south gate as both a node and a landmark. Then east of the city, it's the East Lake, so the East Barai, we know that. North of the city is the North Barai, we also know that. So from a perspective of a Chinese visitor in the 13th century, so 1296, 1297 CE, these are important landmarks. These are important notes that help him talk about the city and help him navigate the city, right? And it follows the exact north-south axis that we use to go to Angkor today. These landmarks are familiar with us for those of you who have visited Angkor. These are common landmarks. These temples are landmarks of Angkor. You know Angkor when you know these. Sorry. So in this LiDAR image, so we remove the tree covers and reveal the ground surface. What you see, the small dots here inside Angkor Thom are ponds. And next to them are mountains where people used to live. And inside Angkor Thom itself, you could see a series of linear lines crossing north, south, and east, west, also extend beyond the city walls. These are city blocks. These are streets that form city blocks. And you could see that also inside Angkor Wat, right? More rigid patterns of mounds and ponds and irregular grid patterns make out of city streets. So for example, our work in Angkor Wat. On the top, you see the image, the aerial photos of Angkor Wat covered with trees. At the bottom is the ground surface produced by LiDAR. So you see we can make up the grid system of roads that that create city blocks of mounds and ponds that we could then use to give a general scheme of what habitation inside Angkor Wat looks like. So you see a regular patterns of 4 mounds, 4 ponds per grid, so per square. And inside Angkor Wat, we could make up around 2,083 mounds. And if we visualize each mound to contain just one house, between 5 to 10 persons living in that house, then the populations could inside Angkor Wat itself could be between 1,500 and 1,300. Oh, I'm sorry, 1,500 and 3,000 people, sorry. And colleague at Virtual Angkor project based at the University of Monash used the same data to visualize Angkor as it was. So you see the grid patterns of streets and then mounds and ponds that has houses on them. And also when we talk about city again, we imagine where the water comes from, right? That's a type of infrastructures that we need today. So ponds provide that service. So from our work inside Angkor Wat, for example, so on your top left, that's the ground surface based on LiDAR map. The bottom left, that's our reconstructions of the pond surface when it was still operational, but currently it holds no water. It's because the groundwater surrounding Angkor Wat inside the moat is low. So to reach that level, to make these ponds viable with water, the groundwaters have to reach 1 meter above the current condition. And there are theories that the Barai, the giant reservoirs around Angkor, help increase water table, so it would provide water for these ponds, and then provide amenities. The city dwellers could use this water for bathing, for cooking, etc. Another aspect of city again has to do with road. So we know from ground surveys or mapping that Angkor people were highly mobile. So we have a series of roads that links each provincial centers, major provincial centers, to Angkor, from Pimai in Thailand, Wat Phu in Laos, Sambo Prekuk in central Cambodia, all converge into Angkor. We have the bas relief to show that people actually travel. Right? So you see ox cart there, see people carrying stuff around, traveling through this road. And within the city itself, again, you could see this pattern of roads crisscrossing the city, and also the city wall, right? So this is the type of physical infrastructures in the cities that we could identify. And then what was the function of the walled city? As the previous map, LiDAR map, indicated, city center was not confined to the walled city, was not confined to Angkor Thom. It spread outside the wall. So people were living inside and outside these walls. But then we can read Jota Kwan again. What was the functions of these walls? And we could see the major landmark, the major temples, all look like the Bayonne and the Bapun, are located within the center, within the city center, within the wall city. The Royal Palace is also located within the wall city. And see at the end of this, quote from Jodaquan is that dogs and criminals that have their toes amputated are not allowed in. So this is an early example of gated communities in Angkor that serve a specific function with the governmental institution inside it, where the king lived, where the king conduct official business. So in a sense, this was a central business district in our modern sense. And then we can also talk about city infrastructure. Again, governmental institutions, the palace, judiciaries, securities. We can talk about economic activities that's common to cities, like trade, like markets, shops, craft center. We can talk about social services, like healthcare, hospital, medicine, healers, or education, institutional support through religious school, for example. And of course, leisure and spectacle, right? When you think about cities today, there's a lot of the city life would include leisure, spectacle, like parade, like games that are common to the city. So from Jodaquan description, again, we can look at government institution. So he talked about the palace. He talked about the king would hear court cases from people, even a small one. The king will take audience twice a day inside the palace. So the palace was a government palace, right? It's not just, it was not just function to house the king and his family, but also as to conduct official business, as place to conduct official business. Regular people and officials can go see the king twice a day. And we know also about trade, about market. Inscription talk about trading, barter economy. I have to remind people that there was no money. It was not a monetary system based trade. In Angkor, people barter, so object to objects. And we know from the probably two markets, two type of markets. From the Platon inscriptions, they talk about market day in January or February, in the month of May, where the state would organize these markets. And from Jodaquan description, there was actually an actual active market every day, running from 6 in the morning until noon. So he described it with as where people use mat laid on the ground to sell their things. We have the bas relief that some people do have stall, like in this case, showing a fish market. And we also know that small market transaction, according to Jodaquan here again, rice, the transaction were paid with rice or with other grains or with cloth, right? So at the bottom right, this depending on the interpretations, the common one is a Chinese shop. So you see, well, you see Chinese umbrella hanging on the ceiling. Another aspect, social infrastructure we can talk about in Angkor is education. So from the Chinese description, from the inscriptions, and also from the bas relief, education was done through religious schools, through religious institutions. Like mostly target males. A male boy will become monks or will serve religious teachers, Brahmins inside the temple, and get educated that way. And we know that one of them was actually a huge school. It's a state-funded school that we call Dupong today. It's a temple of Dupong, which was inaugurated in 1186. Just about 100 years before Jodaquan's visit. We know that there were 1,409 teachers and students living together inside the temple compound. And we know that each of them received almost 1 kilogram of rice per day. The inscription itself does not describe vegetable and other things. Right? They said it's too common for them to describe. But our work with, as Noel had mentioned earlier, inside the compound, reveal habitations where people live on mounds close to ponds. So on the top, you see aerial view of the Dupong today, which covered forest with trees. And then at the bottom, you see topographic maps produced by LiDAR. And our work in the eastern section of the enclosure indicate that there were at least 4 patterns of mounds and ponds. Again, mounds and ponds are commonly associated with habitations. But in case of the Dupong, they might serve different patterns of mounds and ponds might serve different functions. And we identified that this southeast quadrant with the same pattern, number 2 here, actually very dense. It shows a lot of modifications. It shows a long-term habitation within the 100 years. So I have a suspicion that this could have housed the 1,409 teachers and students compound. But from what we know, again, go back to our point, is that what we know is education was provided by the state. So state-funded education. We also know about a medical system, again, embedded mostly within religious institutions. The Angkorian and also pre-Angkorian inscriptions talk about medicines provided by the temple or provided to the temple. And not until 1186, until Jayavarman VII, that this sort of healthcare system was formalized into, from what the inscription described as health center, Arogya Sala. There were 102 across the empire. 30 have been identified in Northeast Thailand alone. And we know that the state provide one director from the Dupong again. So the Dupong temple was the state center for education and healthcare. So the state provide one director, possibly a healer, and then medicine. So all distribute from the state treasury. So the next step, the next aspect that I want to get into has to do with city life. So life that we associate with cities in general, like festival, like parade, like leisures. And we can just take a quick glance from 2 inscriptions here. So on the first one is the Prakhan inscription, again under Jayavarman VII. So the inscription described the distribution of supplies from the royals treasury at this interval, the 5th, the 8th to the 15th night. So almost every half month. Then you have the New Year festival, and 18 other festivals that were not described. So that the state heavily involved with that. They provide funding to celebrate them. The inscription also talk about the procession of deities. If you're not familiar, so within the temple, there are this mobile image, commonly made out of metal, bronze, that's very common, that will be taken out of the tower and parade around, right? So either around the temple, in this case, around the temple of Rakan, and also were taken out from their provincial home and parade to the city center. For Rakan, we know that that procession was in the lunar months of Palkun, which is between February and March. The Tabrum inscriptions talk about different kinds of festival. So the spring festival occurred during March and April, and it was celebrated also with the procession of deities. In fact, one of the deity that we know of came from Kampong Jam, so a few hundred kilometers down south. And then the inscription prescribed that during the days of the processions, the neighborhood should have decorated with banners, with umbrellas. They have to have dancers, they have to have music, they have to have flowers around it. So it's a full-on parade. Jodakwan, again, this is like 100 years afterward, described Angkor as that every month there is always an event. So for example, during the 5th month, I got confused by his calendar system. So it turned out to be between April and May. I'm not sure, I have to check on this again. But during the 5th month is God bathing. So water, he called it water to welcome the Buddha, where the Buddhas, in this case God, throughout the country would be brought together and taken into the water. So I think he meant brought into Angkor, which coincided with our inscription here, right? So gods will come from the provincial centers and the cities, parade around, and will bathe in water. We also know about the New Year festival. We talk about the 1st month. It could fall sometimes between November and December. That the Royal Plaza, so on your top right, in red, that's the Royal Palace. Across from it, this space, empty space, is the Royal Plaza. So today you would see a grass lawn in front of the palace. And that's where most of the festival activities took place, the former one, because it took place in front of the palace. A large stage was placed in the Royal Plaza, and that could accommodate over 1,000 people. There were fireworks, firecrackers that last for 15 days. And we know that the officials, provincial officials, and the elites paid for all of that, right? To have this fireworks shows. And that's depicted on your lower left from Maurice period again in the National Geographic magazine, 1960. So the king will sit in front of the palace on the elephant terrace here, and the fireworks was placed in front of the palace. And also from the bas-relief of the Bayonne itself, on your bottom right, you could see the circus, people turning wheel with their feet, balanced kids, band of musicians, that celebrate certain kind of festival that we do not know what they were trying to depict. Zhou Daquan also talked about the 9th month ceremony, where everyone in the country we interviewed in front of the palace. So what this infers is that once a year, you would see an influx of people from the countryside inside the city be interviewed. We do not know what the purpose of this, but keep this in mind, that cities today, like Phnom Penh, for example, during the water festival, millions of people came from the countryside to the city to watch boat race. So in a sense, we talk about city life with festivals, lavish festivals, with parades that attract provincial people into the city. Zhou Daquan talk about games. So they talk about dance in the palace. He talked about bull fights, elephant fights that last 10 days in the 8th month. And we have that to corroborate his account from the temple bas-reliefs, right? So on the top, you have bull fights, on the top right. You have cock fights. You have elephant fight carved into the elephant terrace. And then he talked about ball games. So at the north end of the elephant terrace, there's a carving depicting polo games. So that's kind of ball game, but this one is horses. He talked about rice burning outside of the South Gate. Again, South Gate seems to be the main reference point for Zhou Daquan. Even for us today, visiting Angkor, the South Gate seems to be the main node of the city. He talked about women riding chariots and elephants to watch the rice burning rituals. He talked about public bathings involving mostly women, that there were thousands of them gathered every couple of days to bathe in the rivers. So this is some sort of city life, right? We think about it, there's just a lot of people doing the same thing at a schedule in irregular intervals, a regular schedule. We have the bas-relief that shows a queen or palace woman on palanquin traveling. We also have the temple depicted on the wall of the Bayonne that shows a worship of a god, in this case Vishnu. But you could see the banners, the parasols, and flowers in all these temples, right? So imagine that these temples, the temples in Angkor, were alive and were full of these flowers, with music, with banners, with umbrellas. So it gives us a sense of what city was like, what could we experience the city of Angkor. Another aspect that I want to talk about is production and consumption. This will be short. It's just that in Angkor, these activities of building temples, of producing high cultural art was occurring at the city centers. So large statues, metal statues, like bronze statues that are now in Mandalay, Myanmar, most likely produced at the center. And whatever produced at the center in Angkor, it produced a style that was later adopted in the province. So you see a new design, temple design or statuary type at the center. You would also see it at the provincial center. And building temples, building these, will take a lot of people to build them, right? It would absorb people from the countrysides across the empire, across the surrounding rural area, not just to produce, not just to build the temples, but also to maintain them, to provide service for them, to give food for offerings, to get flowers, to provide maintenance, farmers that farm rice for the temple, those who cook for the temples. So a lot of people have to service these temples. And again, when one style occurred at Angkor, like in this case, statues of Lokeshwara in Jayavarman VII's reign, occurred everywhere across the empire. And another aspect of city, even today, is ethnogenesis. That means making a sense of an ethnic group, an ethnic belonging. In general, cities are full of strangers. So how were people in Angkor communicated with one another? How were people from different provinces that came to Angkor at a set schedule talk to one another, but at the same time still preserve their identity as, you know, people coming from this province or people coming from that province? And also we know that in Angkor there were other ethnic groups too. We have on the bottom leaf of the Bayonne, there were the Chinese, and from Jodakuan account, he talked about Siamese populations. He talked about mountain slaves living inside Angkor. The inscription talk about Cham, about Mon, about Burmese that provide service to Angkor. So Angkor was full of these people from different backgrounds, but what it does provide is a sense of belonging, of being part of this great city. And it coincides with the fact that when the city of Angkor was created, under Yasovarman, we start to see the term Kamboja, Cambodia. There's a sense of an ethnogenesis, of belonging to Cambodia being built when the city of Angkor started. So comes to my point again. So from the city of God Kings or lost city to lost in a city. So the narrative of lost city began with the colonial period, right? So when the colonial explorer came to Angkor, they were overwhelmed with the jungles and also overwhelmed with the contradiction that they could not imagine the poor Cambodians, or what they call the minor kings, they called Norodom as minor king, could ever build the majestic temple like Angkor. So must these temples be lost because they built by a different race? So this sense of lost city has a lot of baggage, colonial baggage to it. But when we visualize Angkor in the sense of cities that we experience today, another perspective emerged, right? So we can talk about sensory overload. When you go into Angkor, you experience different things. Imagine if you're from countryside, like I was from a country going to Phnom Penh. The first few days, it was adjustment. A few months, it just, everything was different. The people, the landscape. And in Angkor, imagine walking in Angkor if you were from a different area, passing through the landmarks like Angkor Wat, Bakang, the city gates, etc. And all of these temples were gilded with gold, right? Plastered with white plaster with red color, all glittering everywhere. You see the statues like Jodakuan did, the giants and the gods pulling the naga of the south gate, feeling larger than life. Then when you walk inside the cities, you feel confused by this good system of roads and canals that define the city blocks. You have houses surrounded by different fruit trees, by vegetable gardens. In the cities, you could catch a glimpse of the royal and elite possessions because that's where they lived. And also, there are rituals, there are ceremonial gatherings on almost a bi-weekly schedule according to the inscriptions. So there were a lot going on inside the city. You could imagine the soundscape, right? The band, the music, following the parade, following the rituals, the ceremony. the hymns, the songs that radiating out of these temple establishment in Angkor, not just Hindu temple, not just Brahminist temple, Buddhist temples or other sects of Shaivite or Vaishnavite that have different scriptures, different chains, different hymns that people use. You can't imagine the odoscape, the smell of the perfumes and incense, flowers that came from the temples, that came from the offerings that ornate different festivals inside Angkor. Jota Kwan even talked about people perfume themselves with mixtures of sandalwoods, of fragrance, right? So this whole sensory overload, it just enhanced the image of Angkor as a city full of greatness, a prosperous city, the sacredness of the temple of the city, and also of the ruler itself. Jota Kwan certainly did. And you could go on and visualize Angkor through these two websites here. Virtual Angkor, that I mentioned earlier, that produce image of Angkor based on recent research. And also you could go to soundsofangkor.org that reproduce the sounds, the music that might have played in Angkor, right? So my conclusion here is the unlost city of Angkor. The city, one thing to keep in mind is that cities and civilizations transform through time. Angkor transformed from a political city, from the base of an empire, to a religious city, to a religious center, a pilgrimage center that the European in the 17th century described it as the Buddha's Rome, the Vatican of Buddhism. We have records of Japanese pilgrims that came to Angkor, and then we have the French record, this French Jesuit, Louis Charon, 1668. It is called Angkor. So Siam, Thailand, people from Thailand, from Burma, from Laos, from Peninsular Thailand, he called it Nasrim, all came to make pilgrimage here at Angkor, even if they were at war, right? And the emphasis here is that even if they were at war, people still came to Angkor and came to worship it. So Angkor, in the sense that name, is not just any city, it's the city for these people, for the surrounding neighbor of Cambodia today, for people that used to live inside Angkor. So Cambodia call it Angkor, the city. In Thailand, especially Ayutthaya, it was known as Nakhon Luang, again, the royal city. So it lives on in the memory of peoples in these countries. The transformation of Angkor itself did not stop, right? It's continued to be tourist attractions, management of a tourist center of a World Heritage Site, that again, the life of Angkor continues. And my point here is that Angkor as a city was never lost. So thank you.
Thanks, Piphal, for the great talk. I was really struck by what you said about the sensory overload, and I've never thought of it that way, and it makes so much sense. If I may, we've got quite a few questions already, and if I may take the prerogative as the convener, as something that I saw in your slides was that each person in Raja Vihara was given a kilo of rice per day.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of rice to eat per day.
Exactly. That was the calculation they made while we were excavating there. Give or take 0.9 something kilograms per day given to these people. That was a lot of rice. But what it did not, the inscription did not indicate was that whether the religious teacher had families living with them, whether rice for them, ration for them would include their family members as well. So that we do not know. Right? There's a lot of missing information about these inscriptions. So we know relatively well that there were a lot of people supporting this center, education and health center, but we do not know exactly how many people lived inside the compound, other than the students and teachers.
Okay, so we're getting questions fast and furious now, and I'm gonna try and get through as much of them as possible. So I'm gonna start with the oldest, and we'll do like a quick fire, because some of them can be answered quite easily. So Dong-Mi Kim, I believe she's a docent at the museum in Singapore. She has a couple of questions. Number one, So Tok Wan mentioned women at the market. The women take a main role in the economy.
Mhm.
And yes, that's a yes or no question. And then her second question is, what kind of calendar do they use?
What kind of what? I'm sorry.
Calendar.
Calendar. Oh, calendar. From the inscriptions, pre-Angkor, since we have a dated calendar from 611 CE, there's always a lunar calendar adopted from India. So it's a lunar system. But from what Cho Dak Kwan said, the numbering of the month was different from the Chinese calendar. So there were work done, there were some conversion done. I think Paul Pelio, who translated, and Dr. Des had done some conversion with the Cho Dak Kwan and Angkorian calendar, but I just have not delved into that deeply.
All right. Next question from Jeffrey Benjamin from the College of Humanities in NTU. There is linguistic evidence of Khmer influence in the lower parts of the Malay Peninsula beyond the Angkorian state. Is anything known about Angkorian maritime activities, or would this contact be overlap?
So far, nothing is clear about Angkorian maritime activities. We know that until the 12th century, did Angkorian rulers send tribute to China and also invade northern Vietnam using ships. But we do not know the extent of their maritime activities, especially going into peninsular Thailand and Malaysia. Like we have inscriptions, several Angkorian inscriptions there. If I remember correctly, dated to the 11th century. But that is very few. It's still use Khmer language and things like that, right? But the evidence that tie that into the Angkorian state is still unclear.
Right. Another question from Heidelita about Plaza. Is it true that the decline of Angkor was due to the inability to control the water?
That's one of the theories. I mean, when we look at the decline of a city, of a civilization in general, there's no one reason that contribute to the decline, right? It can be many reasons. It can be the lack of controls of water. It can be climatic conditions. So we have recent papers by colleagues from the University of Sydney that talk about different climatic conditions, the fluctuating climatic conditions that contribute to failure in water management system. But also we know of political instabilities toward the end of Angkor, right? So we have different provincial centers, like the one that became in Lopburi, that began to take over by Yuchia. So that kind of social and political factors also contributed to that. We know that the social and economic system could have changed associated with the transition into Theravada Buddhism. So that's also another factor. Another economic factor is greater involvement with the maritime trade network, because toward the end of Angkor, we start to see more trade envoys being sent to China. And all of these factors could contribute to the decline of Angkor.
Yeah, as I recall, there are many factors at play for decline. It's probably not just one factor, but many factors.
Yeah, exactly.
Patricia Welch from the Southeast Asian Ceramics Society asked if there were local ceramic production centers in Angkor, and if so, where were they in the size?
Ceramic productions. So there are two types of ceramic we can talk about. The urban ceramic production associated mostly with earthenware production. So earthenware refer to utilitarian ceramic, like pots, cooking pots, frying pans made out of clay. That we know of two centers, two production area inside Angkor, not inside the core, but toward the edge of the 13th century city. That we know of, we have good dates. In fact, my colleagues at Apsara, Chai Rachana, Tantina, and with Dupong, are working on one of them, which is just outside of the north gate of Angkor Thom. Our work as part of the Greater Angkor project and the University of Hawaii work with Apsara was at a site called Kokno, which is just east of Strasrang, east of the Phnom. So that was also another ceramic production area. In fact, a paper that we co-author is currently being reviewed and will come out soon. Another type of ceramic production that we know is associated with stonewares. So stonewares were placed outside of the city. So in the Kulen Mountain, around there were a series of kilns that produced mostly green glazed ceramics and unglazed stoneware ceramic. And also other stoneware kiln group that we found that we know so far are in northeast Thailand. So those group produce mostly brown glazed ceramics and bicolor green and brown ceramics that were imported to Angkor. The third ceramic production area that we know of is near Phnom Penh at a site called Cheng Ak. So we have my colleague Pon Kazaka worked on there for years, and we have good dates. We have good idea of the chronology of the ceramic production. Some of those were found from our excavation inside Angkor Wat. So those are the three stoneware production center that we know, two urban production centers that we know.
Oh, are you tired yet?
I'm good. I can just keep
Okay,
going.
good. I've got lots of questions. Everyone's got lots of questions. So I'm gonna power them through. Susan Needham from CSU Dominguez Hills asks if they know if there are any image of I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, Baisai, B-A-Y-S-I, offerings at any of the temples.
That is not quite clear. So Baisai is a type of ritual paraphernalia that involve using, let's see, coconut is one of them, banana tree, but the trunk of the banana tree, leaves, betel nuts, betel leaves that were made into a conical shape, sometimes very tall nowadays. It's common in Cambodia and Thailand rituals. But in Angkor, so far, I personally don't know. There was a few images that look like that, but I can't definitely say that it was by say.
Professor Kwa Chongwan from Temasek History Research Centre asks,
Oh, hi.
how were the great temples built? How long did it take to build the Bayonne? And as a side to that, so would visitors see a lot of construction work going on to these temples?
Well, that actually I do not know. My work at the temple in Angkor and some outside of Angkor. So there are different construction techniques, but the common one is called the foundation trench. They excavated the trench and then refill it with sand, with stones, compacted sometimes with limestones to make it harden and then build it from the ground up. But we do know that there were people were brought into the city to build these temples. Our work inside Angkor Wat, we found that at the bottom layers, when they started to lay out the Angkor Wat compound with moats, with ponds and mounds, the bottom layers, there is this stratum of utilitarian cooking wares mostly. That commonly, if you were to build a temple, that's where you place your worker, like right next to the main temple structure that made out of stone and sandstone and laterite. And this area, we also see inside both Angkor Wat and the Prom, a higher density of sandstone chips. So you have to carve it out from the temple to produce these chips. Before, a series of layers that were laid on top of these that would serve as the foundation for future settlement, right? The distinct settlement, people who later we know from the inscription that live in this temple. So yes, in one way, people from the countryside that came to Angkor could see these temples being built. In fact, I only remember reading one inscription that talked about some exchange going on during the construction of a temple inside Angkor. But this is an elite account from the countryside that said they came to Angkor, they worked on this project of building a temple, and an exchange of slaves happened there. So that's what we know of. So in a way, yes, people did see the temple construction.
I remember just growing up in Singapore, I always remember there's always some construction going on somewhere. So, your what you said about, the experience of the century overload of the city. I remember as a kid, I was thinking, why is there never a time where no one's building anything? Everyone's always building something. A city state like Singapore.
It's busy.
Yeah. Betty, friends of the museum, asks if Luban mentioned by Zhou Daoquan referred to the legendary master craftsman.
Yes, so that let's see who talked about this one. Sorry, I can't remember the author that talked about this one, either from Bernard Philippe Gaulier or from Sudas himself. But so Luban refers to this master craftsman in China, right? But the story of Angkor Wat especially, for Cambodia today, Angkor Wat was built by Pistuka, that a term derived from the Sanskrit term for the master of craftsmen, Visvakarma, as a god of craft. So we suspect, I suspect that that legend, when the time that Jotaquan came to Angkor Wat itself became a legend. It was no longer that people build this temple is so perfect that it must have been built by this god of craft, Viswakarman. And when the Chinese in Angkor picked this up, because remember, Jotaquan learned a lot of his stories from other Chinese living in Angkor. So the translation from Viswakarma to Luban is just instantaneous. Right? It is a similar concept of the god of craft. So when they call the tomb of Luban, it's just conformed to the Khmer legend of how Angkor Wat was built.
A couple of comments now. One from Takpo Lai on the odorscape. You didn't mention the animals, elephants, cattle. I'm sure they smell. And Tom Chandler also mentions, he says that I remember Dan Penny saying that Angkor was probably also very smoky with a lot of charcoal production.
Mm.
So yeah, so two comments about the odorscape of the city.
Yeah, definitely. If you have a high concentration of people living in Angkor, making food and everything there, so I think that it makes sense with a lot of charcoal concentrations, and of course animals, because animals like cows or goats remains the temple offering that we could see inside the inscriptions. And they talk about feast involving killing a pig for feast, for example. But so far in our excavated unit, our excavated trench, we haven't found reliable faunal remains to corroborate those yet.
A question from Sue Ann Lee about the water supply to the city. Could you elaborate on the concept of agro-urbanism? And were there any specific designs for water sustainability?
I would invite you to read our recent article on evolution of agro-urbanism in Angkor. Our main author is Dr. Alison Carter, which is published this year, in fact. So the idea generally is that agro-urbanism was a common urban form for pre-industrial cities. So because many of them were farmers, you would have placed in Angkor rice fields around the city center, right? So the field itself were incorporated into this urban design. And you could talk about water management as part of agro-urbanism. So the ponds, the reservoir, the canal systems that have been recorded in Angkor could be associated with this urban form. So there's no strict form of what agro-urbanism look like, but generally there's a city center that would have what we call a civic ceremonial center in archaeology. So that it would involve temples, plazas, elite households that concentrated in the city center. And then you have empty space between the city centers and the rural areas surrounding it. These empty space would serve as the agricultural field. So that's the most boiled down concept of the city form. But please explore further in the article called Evolution of Agro-Urbanism, I think in Angkor.
All right, I'll direct any of our audience, if you have questions for Paul, if we don't get to them as well, or if you like a slide or some of the papers that he's mentioned, please contact Dr. Heng, and he'll provide you with those materials. I'll get on to a few more questions before we have to end. Wolfdale Tori asks, what do you think about the relationship of Angkor and Moro Jambi, Sumatra? And is there any, do you have any perspective about its networks?
I don't know so much about Jambi. So I don't think I can't answer your question satisfactorily. Sorry. Yes, but so far what we know from the epigraphy, from the inscriptions, is that everything was focused on Angkor itself, right? That because the topic of the inscription has to do with temple foundations. It never, the topic of the inscription never talk about foreign relations.
All right. Fu Shu Tian from now the National Library of Singapore asks, the recent research of Angkor suggests a unique trajectory for Southeast Asian urbanism as compared, so does what we know of Angkor suggest that there's a unique trajectory of Southeast Asian urbanism compared to what we know from South Asia?
So what we know from South Asia?
And China. So
in China.
yeah, does the urbanism that we see in Southeast Asia and Angkor suggest that it's fundamentally different from China?
I think that needs a lot of clarification. Of course, not all of them are alike. But when we describe ancient cities, it varied from place to places, from civilization to civilizations, and each cities will have to accommodate their cultures, their way of life, their resources, the surrounding resources that would also influence city form, but without knowing the specificity of the different trajectory, I can't really answer your question.
All right. At this stage, I'm going to cherry pick some of the larger questions that I think might be useful for everybody. And I'm sorry for people whose questions I don't reach to, but please again feel free to contact Dr. Heng clarification. Ulrika from the Wilson from the ACM asks if the Chinese would have considered Angkor as a Buddhist Rome.
For the Chinese, actually, we don't know. We have no data on that, other than Zhou Daquan description of Angkor as Luban's tomb. We only know of Japanese, for sure. Japanese called Angkor Wat Jetavana, so the ancient temple, ancient pagoda in India, right?
Yeah, they thought they were in India, but they were not really. Mahesh Uniyal asked, why dismiss the lost city narrative as colonial baggage when it's a fact?
As I have made my point here, Angkor was never abandoned. The people, the colonial baggage that I talked about were the Europeans who came to Angkor and claimed that it was lost. But the people were still there. When the European came, Angkor Wat was still a thriving Buddhist center. The local told the French where the palace was, and that's why we know where that's still called the Royal Palace. They have certainly not the exact memory from when Angkor was built, right? But in this way, people were still living there. People were still living inside Angkor. There were a few people still there, especially near the south gate. People still live like outside of the northern section of Angkor Thom. It's a village called Angkor Krao, the outside Angkor, the outer Angkor. So people were still living there. It's just that Angkor was no longer a capital city. Its political functions was lost. It was no longer associated with political power, but it shifts. The function shifts to symbolic functions, became a religious center. People still went there. People still go there today, conducting rituals associated with these temples. So we know all of that. We, in fact, have a good records of inscriptions from the 16th, 17th century, European inscription, Japanese document, later European travelers, the 18th century. There were people still there in Angkor. It was never lost.
Yes, I remember. I think it was only Moreau, like, you know, fantasized publicly about this lost narrative, but we do have like 16th century European accounts of people living in. It wasn't more like marketing to sell books, right, other than.
Yeah, but as I had mentioned earlier, the image was that, well, the Khmer that they encounter in Cambodia, because Cambodia was at that point, the society, the politics, the state was very different, because when the French came in, there were a series of wars between Thailand, Cambodia, or Siam back then, Cambodia, Vietnam. Thailand and Vietnam fought inside Cambodia. So there were a lot of these coming down to play, and then Cambodia, as a polity, turned out to be a loser, turned out to be the losing side. So when the French came in, they just cannot reconcile this different image. Like, how can the people, the king in Cambodia, build this temple, right? Because they were poor, they had no power. So the image of Angkor with these giant stone monuments must not have been built by the same people that they encountered. So in a sense, from their perspective, it's the degenerations of a race, of a Khmer race. So yes, it has to do with colonial baggage. It has to do with racist baggage.
All right. I'm going to go to the last two questions, and I apologize to everybody else for not being able to reach to your questions. This one is from Laksmai, Mong Chang Laksmai from Mokta. He asked that Todakwan described relevant structures of Angkor Thom to interpret the Angkorian capital. But do you know where Todakwan himself lived in?
No.
There was no Four Seasons back then.
No, he never talked about where he lived. But it's just we don't have a reference point to pinpoint exactly whether he lived inside or outside the city even. But I think from these landmarks, from these the point of reference that he referred to was already common. He did not came and then measure all of these, but people who lived inside Angkor, the Chinese who lived inside Angkor that talked to him, we would give out this measurement, right? Because that's where they live, that's where they orient themselves through the city. So it's when we talk about city, again, in the city, you experience the city through nodes and landmarks. So you could actually give out a distance by just counting memories, because that's where you walk, that's where you travel. So what he gives out is not an actual measurement, but people told him that, well, it's about this long, from here, from point A to point B, for example.
And our last question for this session from Veronica Walker. Hi, Vero, at University of Helsinki. He's heard you talk about where you discussed Angkor in the context of the archaeology and compassion. And she was wondering how this could apply to the city. How does the city apply compassion towards?
Well, I think that overall it has to do with a general politics. With the archaeology of compassions, I talk about healthcare, I talk about rituals being funded by the state, especially something that would be equivalent to today's the Festival of the Dead. So rituals that would provide reliefs to the dead ancestor. That was funded by the states. So in a sense, compassions go along with state power. So that the hospital that was commissioned from the center throughout the kingdoms, throughout the empire, was supported, was sponsored by the states, right? So in that way, religions, politics, rituals, and compassions goes hand in hand. So I don't think that it's not reconcilable to associate cities as the state foundation, as the state center, as the seat of the as a seat of the polity. What commissions these social service projects, these compassions toward the people that they rule. So that will involve, again, providing relief for people like healthcare, education, religious endowment.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you, Dr. Heng, and we look forward to the time when we can come back and visit Angkor again, and the time where I can come and see you face to face and buy you a beer.
Me too.
Thanks everyone for joining us this morning, and we hope to see you for our next talk on the 4th of August. So please join us then. All the information is on the ISEAS website. Thanks once again. And
thanks, Noel. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, good evening, good night.